Well, my first memory of sewing was when I was about 4 years of age. I remember standing at the kitchen table at home and my mother was making me a dress on a Singer sewing machine. And I was very small because I was only about the height of the table, and she allowed me to turn the handle of the machine as she was sewing the dress. And she taught me everything I know really about sewing, about dressmaking. And I started making my own clothes when I was a teenager, and I did that for a long time. And then in my 20s I discovered quilting, and as soon as I discovered quilting, that was the end of the dressmaking, because I was completely hooked on quilting. So essentially I'm a quilter and a dyer. I started out as a patchwork quilter, making bed quilts using commercial fabrics. And I did that for a very long time, and I made dozens of quilts. Baby quilts, cot quilts, bed quilts, quilts for relatives, etc. And it got to a stage where I wanted to change it slightly and design my own work. So I did that, and then I got into fabric dyeing. So what I'm doing now is that I am combining my own designs with my own hand-dyed fabrics, and I'm making wall quilts. Now they're essentially bed quilts, but for walls. I'm using all the same traditional techniques, but in a contemporary way. While I loved the traditional quilts, and I still make some, I wanted to be freer with my designs. So one of the things I like to do is to take a traditional pattern, for example, a log cabin pattern, and I like to change it slightly. And I might do that by changing the shapes of the fabrics, or the strips of fabric that make up the block. Rather than having regular rectangles, I might skew them. Rather than having a square in the middle, I might have a triangle. And that, combined with the dyed fabrics, give it just a more up-to-date image. I like to keep the connection with the traditional, but change it slightly. One of the themes that I use quite often is the theme of the sea. I was born by the sea and I grew up by the sea, and I'm actually a Piscean as well. And I find myself drawn again and again back to the blues and the navies and the turquoises and the greens. And even when I'm dyeing, if I have a dyeing day at home, I find myself reaching for those colours straight away. I've tried to wean myself off those colours and go towards reds and other colours, and I have done that. But again and again I find myself being drawn back to that. I just love the variations in the sea and how it changes so much, and how it's always different. And I think that's a theme I'll always be exploring. I like geometric shapes, and I like to explore them and to see where they'll take me. My method of working is probably slightly different from what other traditional quilters do, in that most quilters plan their work. They might do it on paper. They might have the pattern designed and the fabrics chosen before they start. But I work in completely a different way. I never know what the finished product is going to be like. The only thing I do know when I'm starting out is the actual finished size of the piece. I think part of the enjoyment for me is in the not knowing what the finished result is going to be. And I get a kick out of pulling down fabrics and starting cutting and sewing and just seeing what happens. Oftentimes I will have a dyeing day or 2 dyeing days in a row, and I'll dye 50 metres of fabric with no particular purpose in mind. But when I have them washed and ironed and dyed and up on the shelf, I might look at them and a piece might suggest something to me. And that could be the starting point for a piece of work. Another thing I'm interested in is what I call memory quilts. A couple of years ago we had a family gathering. It happened to be the 100th anniversary of my grandparents' wedding. And I found the one and only existing photograph of my grandmother and grandfather and the 8 children. And I printed that photograph and other family photographs onto fabric. And I made that into a quilt. I worked as a primary school teacher, and every year I made a point of getting the children to dye a metre of fabric at the start of September. And they dyed that metre of fabric in 3 or 4 different colours. So they had 3 or 4 different pieces of fabric, and we used those fabrics throughout the year for the other sewing projects that they did. They made little patchwork pieces. they made various items throughout the year. And what I liked about that was that, as well as teaching them the traditional techniques of hand sewing, patchwork and stitching, that each of their pieces was unique because they all dyed their own fabric, each in a different way. Recently I've been doing a lot of dyeing of blacks and greys and reds. And I'm planning a series of quilts based on red and black and white. So I'm exploring circles in this particular series, and beyond that I don't know where it's going, but that's what I'm working on at the moment.